Hey everyone, Disappointed Giant here. So I was looking back at my recent videos and I realized that a lot of what I put out over the past several months has been related to 5BC or endgame content. I haven't really zoomed out lately, so I wanted to take some time and get back to the basics. The purpose of this video is to showcase some early game and beginner builds that will help newer players learn how items work together. These will hopefully give you some foundation to put your own twists on them as you get deeper into your Dead Cells journey. Each build will have a core pair or trio of items that make up the base mechanics of the build, and we'll stack another item or two on top of those to make the builds even stronger. All of the items I'm going to mention in this video are available without needing to beat the game, and there are no DLC items, so everything here is available in the base game. You will need the Vine Rune from the Promenade of the Condemned and the Teleport Rune from the Toxic Sewers for a few of these items. If you haven't gotten those runes yet, or if you need more of an in-depth beginner's guide, I recommend checking out my 0BC tutorial video, which I'll link below. If you don't have some of the blueprints I mentioned, I recommend unlocking the Specialist Showroom from the Collector. This costs 150 cells and will only appear after you've spent cells and unlocked 20 other items. The Showroom has an item called the Hunter's Grenade that you can use to get blueprints from enemies. The way this works is you throw the grenade at an enemy, which turns it into an elite. Then you need to get its HP down to about half before you can extract the blueprint. Things like the Wolf Trap and Ice Grenade will help keep the enemy in place and make the process easier for you. There are 9 builds in this video: 3 Brutality, 3 Tactics, and 3 Survival. I tried to cover some different styles across the board here, so if you're still trying to find out what kind of gameplay feels best for you, I hope that something here fits the bill. So without further ado, let's get rolling. The first build is a Brutality build that I call Death by 1,000 Cuts. The weapon you'll be using here is the Balance Blade, which is a Brutality melee item that's unlocked from the very beginning of the game. The Balance Blade has fast attacks where it gets stronger with each successive hit, and after 10 hits your attacks will be crits. To pump up its damage even more, we're going to be taking the Combo mutation, which is also unlocked by default. This mutation grants a damage bonus for each successive hit on an enemy, which is shown in the upper right part of the screen. Combo's damage bonus expires after 2 seconds of not hitting an enemy or after you take damage, so the more successful hits you have, the more damage those hits will do. Another mutation I'm going to recommend here is the Melee mutation, which you get from beating the Concierge 5 times. This mutation slows enemies down with your melee attacks, so not only will you be doing solid and fast damage with the Balance Blade, the enemies will also be slower to react, so you'll have a better chance of not taking a hit and breaking your combo streak. If you want a fast, up-close melee build to sharpen your sword with, Death by 1,000 Cuts may be just what you're looking for. Our second Brutality build is a Bleed build, which I'm calling Fresh Blood. The main weapon here is the Blood Sword, which is 100% drop from the green zombies in the prisoners' quarters. If you don't get this on your first run, you'll likely end up getting it on your second or third. The Blood Sword is also close range, but swings a little bit slower than the Balance Blade and procs bleeding on any enemy that you hit. The way bleed works in Dead Cells is similar to the Soul series. After an enemy has enough bleed stacks, it will do a burst of damage and the stacks will reset. So your best bet for a bleed build is to pile on as many bleed stacks as possible as quickly as possible. There are 2 turrets I'm going to recommend here that will help get that bleed going even faster. The first is the Sinew Slicer, which is unlocked by default. This is a longer range turret that will shoot out projectiles that do some decent damage and proc bleed. On its own, these 2 items work pretty well together, but the second trap I recommend is going to push this build over the top. You'll also want to get the Cleaver, which is a rare drop from the runners from the prom. This Brutality only trap used to be called the Meat Grinder for reasons you'll understand as soon as you use it. The Cleaver throws down several tiles worth of saw blades that slow down an enemy and make it bleed. The Cleaver has an 8-second cooldown and the Sinew Slicer has a 10-second cooldown, so you'll be able to keep them out with relative ease. You'll be getting a lot of damage between your rapid attacks from the Blood Sword and the bleed stack from both the sword and your 2 turrets. After you finish a run with this build, make sure you clean up to get rid of all the fresh blood, since there will probably be a lot of it. This final Brutality build I'm going to talk about is the Swift Predator build, which focuses on using the Swift Sword as your main damage output. This blueprint is obtained by beating the daily challenge for the first time. Swift Sword does critical hits when you have a speed buff, and killing enemies will prolong the speed buff since it refreshes on each kill. The first mutation we're going to pair this with is Predator, which is a 10% drop from the invisible automaton enemies in the clock tower. In my opinion, Predator is one of the strongest mutations in the game for Biome since it gives you between 1 and almost 3 seconds of invincibility when killing an enemy with the melee attack. This gives you lots of room to run around and cause some mayhem. The goal here is to kill a handful of enemies to get a speed boost so the Swift Sword will start to crit, and then Predator will de-aggro other enemies after each kill. Enemies will likely die within a couple of hits, so you'll constantly be refreshing your speed buff and getting invincibility and safety from Predator. I'm also going to recommend pairing the Velocity mutation with this build, which is dropped by the Timekeeper on the 5th kill. This mutation extends your speed buff by 3 times, so you'll be getting 30 seconds of bonus speed instead of the normal 10. I enjoy pairing Swift Sword and Predator on their own, but stacking on Velocity really makes this build shine. Alright, so on to tactics we go. Our first build I've called Fire and Steel, which focuses on damage over time using firebrands and throwing knives, 2 items that are both unlocked from the beginning of the game. You're going to put the throwing knives in your main slot, so the one on the left, and the firebrands in your secondary slot, so the one on the right. There are 2 ways to play this. Either you can repeatedly press both buttons to attack, or you can turn on the hold to attack option in the gameplay menu and just hold them both down simultaneously. Both of these items do some kind of damage over time. You'll get fire from the firebrands and bleed from the throwing knives, so enemies will be taking consistent ticks of damage. You're going to want to pair this with the Wolf Trap skill, which is also unlocked from the get-go. The Wolf Trap roots enemies and causes them to take extra damage while in the trap, which synergizes great with the DOT you'll be getting from your main weapons. The final piece of the puzzle here is the Support mutation, which grants you a damage bonus when you're near a trap. This is also unlocked from the start. So the goal here is to mash those attack buttons, get lots of fire and bleed damage, and then pump it up with both the Wolf Trap's damage buff and the extra damage bonus from Support. If you want to take this build even further, I'd recommend trying to re-roll the affixes on your items to get bonus damage to burning, bleed, or root wherever you can. The next build I'm going to go over uses one of my favorite pairings in the entire game, Infantry Bow and Point Blank. Infantry Bow is a ranged weapon that does critical hits at close range and is a 10% drop from the undead archers. You'll find lots of them in the prisoners' quarters and in the ramparts. The mutation you'll be pairing this with is called Point Blank, and it's dropped by the corpulent zombies in the Forgotten Sepulchre, which are the mummy enemies. The Point Blank blueprint also has a 10% drop rate. Since the name of the game here is to get up close and personal with enemies, I call this build the Nearsighted Archer. Infantry Bow and Point Blank were practically made for each other. Point Blank is a mutation that grants you a 30% bonus damage to close ranged attacks, and it scales up with each stat that you put into tactics, so it only gets stronger as the run goes on. Since your skill slots are both open, what you choose to use there is totally up to you, but I would recommend thinking about taking Instinct of the Master of Arms as a second mutation. Instinct gives skill cooldown with each critical hit, and since you'll be doing lots of those, you'll get some decent cooldown just from normal combat. The Nearsighted Archer build is pretty simple and really easy to get online, but it's really powerful and is a lot of fun to use. And on the other side of the spectrum is our third tactics build, which I'm going to call Personal Space, because it thrives in situations where there are no enemies nearby. The 2 main items you're going to use with this build are the Spartan Sandals, which are 100% drop from the runners in the prom, and the Marksman Bow, which is found in the 8-minute door going into the ossuary. When you kick an enemy with the Spartan Sandals, they get knocked away from you, which synergizes really well with the Marksman Bow since that has a 6 times critical multiplier on enemies that are at long range. The main loop of this build is to kick enemies away with the Spartan Sandals and then use the Marksman Bow to get huge crits once they're out of range. The Sandals also do decent damage to enemies when they're kicked into walls, so if you don't have the runway for distance, you'll still get some good utility and damage when kicking enemies up close. The mutation I pair this build with is Tranquility, which is another one that's unlocked right from the start. This grants bonus damage when there are no enemies nearby, which pairs beautifully with the marksman bow. Think of this build as the antithesis to the nearsighted archer build, since the goal here is to keep enemies away instead of getting up close. This build can be really fun once you get into the groove, but I find that it works best in levels like the ossuary that have a little bit more room to work with. So now it's time to hit the third stat and talk about survival builds. The Icebreaker build is 100% open from the beginning of the game and needs no additional blueprints. Your main pair of items here are the Nutcracker, which does critical hits on enemies that are rooted, stunned, or frozen, and Frost Blast, which can freeze enemies in place. The gameplay loop here is to use Frost Blast to freeze any nearby enemies and then smash them to pieces with the Nutcracker. There's no ammo on Frost Blast, so you can use it liberally. I recommend pairing these with the aforementioned Wolf Trap, which will root enemies, and the Ice Grenade, which freezes enemies like the Frost Blast, but it gives you a larger burst for better crowd control. The Nutcracker benefits from all three of the supporting items you'll be using, since they all either freeze or root enemies. I think this build is a smashin' good time. If you're the kind of person who likes playing slower paced, parry-focused strength builds, this one might be the one for you. The Heavy Sword and Bubble Board build pairs the Broadsword with the Rampart Shield. The Broadsword is found on the Training Knight's corpse near the Promenade exit in the Prisoner's Quarters, and the Rampart is a rare drop from the Shield Bearer enemies. The Broadsword has 3 slow and heavy hitting attacks. The second and third hits are crits, and the attack combo takes just about 2 seconds to complete. The Rampart Shield gives you 2 seconds of invulnerability with every successful parry, which feels a little busted. The Broadsword is a great weapon on its own since it has big damage and solid range, but if you attack after parrying an enemy, you'll have just enough time to get through the full combo unscathed while you're protected by the Rampart's bubble. You don't need to use the shield with every encounter, but it will definitely help get all 3 of those swings out. I recommend taking the What Doesn't Kill Me mutation with this build, which is a 100% drop from the disgusting worms in the toxic sewers. This mutation grants you healing with every successful parry, starting at 2% healing and going all the way up to 6. If you're already parrying as part of the build, this extra health is just like a nice bonus to help keep your HP topped off, just in case you take some extra hits along the way. Our final survival build is something that I call Game Over. This is a borderline meme build, but it's so strong that it needs to be mentioned. The 2 items you'll need for this build are the baseball bat and throwable objects, each of which will show up in the prisoners' quarters in their own lore rooms after about a dozen runs. The baseball bat is a really fast melee item that crits on enemies that are stunned or rooted, and throwable objects are a ranged item that target nearby enemies and stun them. The gameplay loop here is simple. Stun an enemy with throwable objects, get lots of fast and quick criticals with the baseball bat, and repeat. Each time you kill an enemy, you'll refill some of the ammo on throwable objects, so you shouldn't run out. I'd pair these items with the Stun Grenade and/or Root Grenade as your skills. The Stun Grenade is in a secret area in the ramparts, and the Root Grenade blueprint is found in the 15-minute door after the concierge fight. Between the throwables and your choice of grenade, enemies won't stand a chance. If you want to crank this up to an even more ridiculous level, you can take the Heart of Ice mutation, which is dropped by the pirate captains in Stilt Village. This mutation grants skill cooldown on stunned or rooted enemies, which you'll be doing constantly with this build. I've seen a lot of new players get their first win with this build, so you might get yours with it too. I hope out of these 9 builds that there was at least one that resonated with you and either gave you a new way to play Dead Cells, or maybe it got you thinking about other kinds of builds you can put together using these base concepts. As I mentioned at the start of the video, these builds are focused on the new player experience, so there's plenty of room for swapping out items or adding even more pieces that will make these builds even better. You could add Open Wounds as a mutation in the Fresh Blood build for even more bleed, use Rapier instead of Balance Blade and 1000 Cuts for a different type of fast attack, or you could choose No Mercy when using Fire and Steel to kill enemies even quicker, and so on. My goal here was to help get things moving for beginners, so hopefully this video did the trick. If you'd like, you can leave a comment below with any questions or if you have any suggestions that you think would be a good addition to these builds. If you'd rather chat closer to real time, you're also welcome to join our Discord, which I'll link in the description below. As always, thank you for watching, and good luck out there.